Now, the first conversation we're going to engage in today is with David Kaiser, colleague at MIT, who's written a remarkable book, How the Hippies Saved Physics, in which he describes, first, the way in which the post-war American turn towards pragmatism in physics really made questioning the foundations of the discipline seem decorative at best, and at worst a fundamental distraction from the real work that physics had to do. For the people that came out of the Manhattan Project, it seemed obvious that you should get on and calculate things. The world was there to be opened up through calculating new phenomena, through designing new devices. It wasn't going to be opened up by asking questions about what quantum measurement really was. In fact, the principal physics journal in the United States, Physical Review, actually for a time more or less banned discussion of the foundations of quantum mechanics. And for a generation of young physicists who grew up in the 1950s and early 1960s, it simply was not part of any aspect of how they considered their work to be defined to think about the kind of philosophical questions that had been so divisive among Einstein and Bohr, Schrödinger and Heisenberg, and all of their followers in Europe in the pre-war period. David looks at this group that called themselves the Fundamental Physics Group, and he understands and describes the ways in which they actually brought fundamental questions, especially about entanglement, back into the heartland of physics.
My name is Dave Kaiser. I teach the history of science and also physics at MIT. I work on really sort of the growth, the change, the development of physics over the 20th century, mostly in the US, but looking at international trends as well. I've been very interested in shifts in the training, the making of young physicists, and how that's reflected different kind of priorities and different intellectual trends and political needs over the span of several decades.
We have this moment then, or a series of moments. We have this physics really as tied to philosophy in very deep ways, from the time of Einstein and even before, but certainly in a way brought absolutely front and center by Einstein in his questioning of the nature of space and time, continuation of those concerns into what causality is, what determinism is, what a measurement is, all of those questions in the 30s, the immigration, the joining with America, the war experience, and then this very pragmatic turn that in the expansion and pragmatic application of physics shunts aside these philosophical questions.
Right.
And one might think that the story sort of ended there, that was simply the triumph of pragmatism over philosophy. Yeah. But something happens, and you've written very nicely about this, about the reanimation of these questions at a moment in the late 60s, early 70s, right. Mostly early 70s, where suddenly the culture is in such turbulence that the whole idea of science as just pragmatic, as just calculational, as proving its worth in its military and industrial applications, suddenly doesn't seem to answer to what a new, smaller, sort of countercultural group wants.
Yeah, it's tied certainly in part to these humongous sort of ebbs and flows, these swings in the basic infrastructure, the means of making young physicists. And so that goes into for a massive change between, say, 1968 and 72, roughly speaking. Lots of things lined up to change U.S. national policy for why we want to make lots of physicists, who's going to pay for them, what will they do. Lots of things change for young people, why they might want to go into physics at the height of the escalation of the Vietnam War and the humongous protests across North American college campuses. And tied up with that was this question of what role should the Pentagon play in higher education? And the physics profession, more than any other field, had become a kind of funded nearly uniquely by defense-oriented projects, not necessarily for defense outcomes. So-called basic research was flourishing, but it was funded on a model where the money ultimately came basically from the Pentagon or closely allied sources. And that became no longer a neutral concern for many physics professors themselves, for many young students, for policymakers, and beyond. And we have the first stirrings of stagflation, a kind of recession. There's just less money to go around anyway. The wheels come off the bus. This kind of post-World War II, post-Sputnik model for making young scientists comes in for, we'll just say, a major reassessment. Basically, it's a collapsing bubble that bursts very quickly.
So one response might be to just steer away from physics altogether.
Right.
When I was first studying physics in high school, I used to have to leave my friends, circle around the trees, come back to a room, and I
Yes.
sort of a samizdat session on physics, and I learned relativity from a teacher there.
Right.
And I couldn't tell anybody
Yes.
that I was taking physics
Right.
because it seemed like something that was so against the grain.
Right.
I think, but there was a group of people that wanted to do physics, and yet not in the business as usual way.
There was so this group that I focused on for my book, they called themselves the Fundamental Physics Group. They spelled physics with an F, which I say means then as now physicists never learned how to spell, but they were very playful and they didn't take themselves too seriously. And they were basically trained in many of the nation's most elite physics departments. They had PhDs, almost all of them, from great programs from Stanford and Berkeley and Columbia and Illinois and all the rest. And their main mistake, their main miscalculation was finishing their PhDs when the bottom fell out. So there was a horrible job crunch across academia, and harshest of all, as far as I can tell, for U.S. physicists. And that's when these young, very well-trained, very earnest and smart people hit the job market, when suddenly there were very few jobs to have. And so one way or another, they kind of bumbled along through the accidents of biography and history, and they made their way independently to the San Francisco Bay Area. Some of them got, at least for a short while, industrial jobs until those jobs, disappeared.
This is sort of 73, 74, 75.
Exactly. That's right. So they were finishing up just as the worst sort of crunch had hit. And they sort of found each other by the mid-70s, and they realized they had time on their hands. Two of them who actually formed the group were still registered graduate students at the time. They were students at Berkeley. So it was Elizabeth Rauscher and George Weissman. And then other folks like Jack Sarfati became very involved. John Clauser went on to great renown within physics, but at the time was having a very hard time in his career. Fritjof Capra joined the group. He would write a kind of iconic book in the midst of this turmoil called The Tao of Physics, still well known. Fred Allen Wolf. I mean, it was a kind of Nick Herbert. They were on the order of 8 to 10 kind of central folks who really found in each other a shared passion for these questions that were not pragmatic, not instrumental.
So Nick Herbert then went on to write a book called Quantum Reality.
That's right.
And another one wrote The Dancing Woolly Masters.
Yeah. So they basically wound up doing an end run around usual communication patterns. We've talked briefly before about this kind of very strong stricture against publishing certain kinds of philosophically minded papers in the Physical Review. So these folks, some of them went on to write best-selling and often award-winning, popular books. They went a different way and got the word out. And at the same time, they had this kind of underground, kind of mimeographed preprint network that eventually reached, around the world through all kinds of curious connections that had to do with anti-Vietnam War protests and a kind of burgeoning counterculture, ESP and ufology and all that kind of stuff. So they really carved out a kind of parallel universe for themselves. They found in each other a shared passion for the kind of deep, fundamental, foundational questions that had been brushed aside in their own training. And then they were not on the kind of standard career track that had seemed so natural between, say, the late 40s and the late 60s.
Some of what they did was to embed physics and physical reality and quantum reality in a kind of broader cultural key.
Right.
But they also had some concrete physics results that went on to become rather important.
They met every week for almost 4 years in a kind of informal brainstorming session, Friday afternoons. And the one topic that dominated their discussions, we have notes from who spoke on what, we have a pretty good sense of what they've focused on. The one topic more than any that they really dove into is called Bell's theorem, or now it's called quantum entanglement or quantum non-locality, many kind of synonyms. And this really cut to the quick of what they were hungry for in terms of this kind of question that at once is deeply amenable to calculation. They're real things to calculate, to puzzle through with equations they'd worked so hard to master in all their problem sets for their formal training. And yet it seems to speak to really bizarre sounding foundational issues. In particular, could quantum theory really be compatible with special relativity? John Bell himself was at least troubled by this and was not sort of at peace with any kind of resolution for quite some time. So here we have these pillars of modern physics, relativity with all its conceptual innovations there, and quantum theory, and Bell's theorem, perhaps stronger than anything that had come before, suggested those might be headed on a kind of collision course. Could there be signaling faster than light? Could events, in some sense, influence the predecessors rather than the future? Could there be all kinds of strange notions about causality and influences at a distance?
So they looked at Bell's theorem, these correlations between phenomena at a distance that seem spooky compared to what we expect if we think of reality determined by little microscopic bits isolated from every other bit, but only deterministically connected into the future. So what kinds of things concretely came out of these sorts of thoughts?
So a number of things we can trace the sort of lineage back to this kind of ragtag group. Most important is now called the no cloning theorem. It's not exactly the same as Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, but one might argue it's equally fundamental. And it says, in roughly speaking, that according to quantum theory, we cannot make an exact copy or clone of an unknown or arbitrary quantum state. That in the effort to do so, we would sort of mess it up and destroy the state we were hoping to copy. So we can't make what Nick Herbert had once called a quantum Xeroxer. And it's not that we can't do it because we're clumsy or because we don't yet have the best nanotechnologies, because the structure of quantum theory won't allow such a thing to happen, at least as we understand it. On a similar foundational basis to the uncertainty principle for trade-offs between position and momentum. No one knew that, no cloning theorem. No one knew that until it was independently discovered 3 different times, all around the same time, by 3 different groups, each of whom were responding to these kind of very smart, clever provocations or instigations from this California-based group. The fundamental physics group. So members like Nick Herbert and variants, other ideas by Jack Sarfati and other, Henry Stapp weighed in. Lots of folks around that seminar table in Berkeley were really banging their head against this, trying to use Bell's theorem or quantum non-locality to see, could they make a faster-than-light telegraph? Could they send a signal from point A to point B faster than light? If so, some of them wondered, not all, could that account for ESP or kind of, outre things? And either way, it seemed to be pretty heady stuff if set against, say, Einstein's relativity and a kind of speed of light being an ultimate signaling limit. And so there was a kind of cat and mouse game that developed over really a couple of years by the late 70s and early 1980s between sort of increasingly clever thought experiments by members of this group that were deeply non-trivial. It turns out now, those folks will agree, most of them were flawed. Each of them was flawed in different ways, but they weren't flawed in an easy way. And discovering the hidden flaw was, in fact, remarkably productive for the whole community. At one point, Nick Herbert tried to publish one of these, fancy kind of techniques, a thought experiment to try to capture quantum non-locality and put it to work. And it was eventually published in a kind of brand new kind of sideline journal at the time. It was published in part because some of the referees wrote back to the editor saying, this must be wrong. I know in my bones this can't be right, but for the life of me, I can't find the hidden error. So you have to publish it, because that way the whole group, it would be what we now call crowdsourcing. Someone out there has to keep banging their head against this. And indeed, that's what many folks did.
So you have these groups now that take a quantum state and reproduce the same thing somewhere else.
Yes.
And the no cloning theorem is important because it says that the old one then has to be destroyed.
Yeah, so the biggest way it leads to is actually, it's related to that, is quantum encryption, quantum cryptography. So the fact that no one can make a copy of an arbitrary unknown quantum state is what is the ultimate protection for using quantum mechanics to encrypt signals, to encrypt hidden messages. And that gets worked out very quickly after the no cloning theorem, which itself is sort of piggybacking on these kind of freewheeling discussions in Berkeley. If someone wanted to try to send messages using quantum mechanics, using entangled particles, they wouldn't send that message faster than light. Those proposals were all shot down. But what they could do is make it secure against any conceivable sort of cyber attack, any conceivable effort to do eavesdropping. Because any eavesdropper would have to sort of tap into that signal, siphon off some photons or electrons, and sort of copy them so as to reverse engineer the signal. And that's exactly what quantum theory, now we understand, tells us we can't do.
So there's a certain irony here that a group that defines itself as countercultural produces this provocation, gets fundamental physics brought back into the system. It leads in a quite direct way to quantum cryptography, which is now used by banks and the National Security Agency. Not exactly what they had in mind.
Ain't it always that way? And so, and the same thing I think could be said for quantum computing, which again grows out of, in some sense, the most wild-sounding ideas about do we live in a multiverse? Is there a constant branching of quantum possibilities? Are there infinite copies of ourselves thinking almost identical thoughts in some neighboring universe? And that doesn't sound like heavily, programmatic or mission-oriented research. And yet, if one can actually build quantum computers, they would have enormous computational power, perhaps enough even to break conventional cryptography. And so we're back into, the worlds of daring do. And so the ideas don't have only one natural kind of valence.
And quantum computing is now hugely invested in by some gigantic corporations.
Right.
It's something that really does seem like a promise, if not for the immediate future,
Yeah.
as where computing may eventually go.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's on more and more university campuses, invested at a high level, national labs, and not just in the U.S., around the world. The whole industry, what's now called quantum information science, that includes things like the quantum cryptography, quantum computing, these cool things like quantum teleportation, a whole umbrella of techniques. It's now a multi-billion-dollar annual affair, tens of thousands of research articles, just a sprawling enterprise that itself has in some sense replicated this uneasy mixture of very cool, cutting edge, but kind of instrumental engineering approaches. They worry about doers to keep their things cooled down very cold, combined with some folks still prodding at this kind of deep, fundamental, overtly philosophical challenge.
So we have a study that you did, how the hippies saved physics. The hippies may have saved physics, but they also did much to construct a gigantic new industry that ranges far and wide. Dave, thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Peter.